Outspoken author and academic Jordan Peterson's legal fight against his profession's governing body hit a snag in the Ontario Court of Appeal. Peterson was fighting a sanction from the College of Psychologists of Ontario, ordering him to undergo remedial social media training. Ontario's highest court declined to hear his appeal of a lower court ruling. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post reporter Tyler Dawson joins me to discuss why Peterson was in hot water with the college, what his lawyer tried to argue in court, and whether there's any further recourse. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Tyler, for those who may not be on social media or YouTube a lot, who is Jordan Peterson? What is he best known for?
Jordan Peterson is a political commentator based in Toronto, although affiliated with the conservative Daily Wire network in the United States. But his sort of his modern life anyways, begins more in Toronto, where he was a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And he became famous starting back in about 2016 when he started objecting to the use of gender pronouns and objecting to federal legislation that would have basically encoded discrimination against transgender people under sort of hate crimes legislation. And he got quite a lot of airtime at that point, objecting to all of that. And around the same time, he also wrote a self-help book called 12 Rules for Life that sort of kicked him onto the bestseller lists and also gave him some degree of sort of international acclaim and attention. And over the past, 8 or so years, he's sort of parlayed those two experiences into becoming a fairly prolific, quite conservative cultural commentator, I think is fair to say. So his evolution has really been from sort of a bit of an obscure university professor who posted lectures on YouTube to a fairly in-demand podcaster and speaker, best-selling author, all those kinds of things. And at no point has he ever not been involved in some sort of controversy. He did sort of vanish for several months while he was undergoing medical treatment. And his daughter is also a podcast star, and he's on her podcast fairly frequently. He writes for the National Post semi-regularly. He's just sort of fairly ubiquitous, I think, especially in terms of Canadians with political opinions. There's not really anyone else, I don't think. Maybe Naomi Klein is the only other Canadian sort of political commentator who is any sort of equal or similarly prominent international reach.
And as you said, he's been outspoken on a number of issues, and this has courted controversy. And I think kind of the biggest, most recent one is he apparently ran afoul of the governing body of his profession, the Ontario College of Psychologists, back in 2022. And at the time, what were the complaints against him?
Well, the complaints were sort of fundamentally about his online conduct. It was some of his tweets, for example. He posted about Elliot Page, saying that Page had their breasts removed by a criminal physician. He had gone after a Sports Illustrated cover model for her weight. He had feuded with Gerald Butts, the former principal secretary to Justin Trudeau, in quite an acrimonious exchange. He had raised concerns about child services involvement in the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. He had talked about climate change on the Joe Rogan podcast. So these sort of statements, these political comments, led to a number of complaints to the college. Now, the college has, as most professional associations do, rules about how their members conduct themselves, outside of the workplace. This is the case for doctors, as we saw during the pandemic. There was disciplinary action for anti-vaccine doctors. Certainly the case for lawyers, and is the case for psychologists as well. So these rules were in place. There were a number of complaints. made about his online conduct. Some of the complaints related to concerns about whether or not he would be able to sort of competently execute his duties as a psychologist. Some of these sort of argued that the comments, were bringing disrepute upon the profession in some fashion. And so the college did an investigation of all of this and basically concluded that yes, some of his online conduct had crossed a line somewhere, and that these risked bringing the profession and the college into disrepute. So that's sort of the origin of this most recent crisis, or controversy. Controversy is a much better word than crisis.
Yeah, and so the college found that yes, ruled that essentially his conduct online violated their code of conduct. What kind of defense did Peterson offer up against these complaints, and ultimately, what was his punishment? What did the college say that he had to do?
Right. Well, his defense was basically that this was political speech and that this was an infringement on his free speech rights. And he's also said that some of his other comments, particularly around transgender people, are actually a professional opinion informed by the literature, and not just the sort of views of someone who isn't qualified to be talking about them. There's sort of lengthy exchanges between himself and the college that sort of detail how he, does monitor his social media. He has a team of people around him to make sure he's staying on track, those sorts of things. But that was all sort of to no avail. What the college decided in the end was that he needed to do some sort of social media training, that he would have to pay for, that would sort of go on until till the trainer felt that he had, gotten to a place where his social media conduct was going to come in line with what the College of Psychologists said was, sort of reasonable and professional in their opinion. So that's sort of where it ended to some extent, in terms of that side of the interaction. Now, what he did after that was he went to the court system and asked the Ontario Divisional Court, sort of lowest level court in Ontario, to rule. Well, he asked them to rule against the college and say that, look, they can't actually police in any fashion the conduct or comments of members of the college that are not related to the professional duties that happen outside of the clinic or the therapy room, that sort of thing. So that's sort of where it ended up, sort of early last year, about January 2023, I think, is when that sort of really came into sort of public consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And, he sought remedy in the courts. Did the lower court ultimately agree with him, or did they say, no, the college is within their right to try and manage the conduct of its members?
Yeah, Peterson lost is the short version of the story. Basically, what the court said was, look, you became a member of a professional association. Professional associations regularly regulate the behavior of the members of that association, and it's not really an infringement on your free speech rights that you have to comport yourself in a particular fashion online. That's sort of the very Coles Notes version. Basically, the court said, look, associations can do that. They all do that. They've been doing it for a long time. This is not, in order to have to undergo social media training is not, sort of this colossal infringement upon your free speech rights. And so that happened, I think, in August 2023. So, about 6 months ago. And Peterson's response was to appeal that decision to a higher court, the Ontario Court of Appeals. Now, just this week, the Court of Appeals declined to hear the appeal from the Ontario Divisional Court. So basically what that means is he's reached the end of the road, in terms of his legal options here. You can't appeal the dismissal of an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada or something like that. So he's at the end of the road in his legal fight over this.
We'll be right back. Now, I mean, ultimately, do we know why the Ontario Court of Appeal has said, no, we don't have time for this, or this isn't under our purview, or we don't want to hear your reasonings?
No, I mean, it's not unusual for an appeals court to simply dismiss without reasons a appeal to them. But no, it was basically a 2 or 3 line thing saying, we do not grant the request for a hearing on this matter. We don't grant the appeal. The lower court ruling stands. So, perhaps that means the Ontario Court of Appeal felt they would just agree with the divisional court. Perhaps they felt that the legal issues raised were not important enough. But no, we don't have sort of a full court ruling that details the three judge panel's reasoning on not granting that appeal.
So where does that leave Jordan Peterson? Is it he gives up his license? Does he just say, I'll cave and do it? I assume that that's not something that is likely, that he's going to cave and go through with this social media training so he can keep his psychologist license.
Yeah, it's a bit unclear. I talked to him earlier this week, and it sounds like he's still sorting out to some extent what his approach is going to be. He certainly could give up his license, and that would sort of end any of this. He certainly could go through with the training, but then at a certain point, it becomes a question of whether or not he has participated fulsomely enough that they're going to allow him to keep his license, or has he sort of failed the training, I guess. And I should take a moment to note that we don't know exactly what that training might look like, because he and his supporters are casting this as some sort of re-education to force him to adopt sort of woke sensibilities. That might not be the case. The case might be more about his language online or something like that. Not to offer a defense of either side here, but I don't think we know precisely what that social media training would look like. It's been cast as some sort of political re-education, but that isn't necessarily the case, although perhaps it is. So he could go through with it. Maybe he fails, maybe he doesn't. The thing that he has also sort of talked about a little bit is doing the training and just making all aspects of it public. Some listeners might remember, for example, when Ezra Levant was before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. I think it was, would have been 15, maybe 20 years ago now, and he sort of broadcast all of this on YouTube back then, and it sort of created this early days of YouTube, early days of the internet sort of scandal about human rights codes. So you can imagine that Peterson would be more than happy to have that sort of fight. He has certainly said that there's the possibility he's no longer going to grant any of the people who've been involved with this anonymity. So perhaps he'll be naming the complainants or naming some of the people who are involved in the decision making with the college. It certainly sounds like whatever sort of road he takes here, he's going to up the ante and certainly not go quietly into the night.
Yeah. I mean, in response to the decision, we know that Peterson, very vocal on Twitter, had talked, demanding that the college itself resign. Looking at it kind of from a legal perspective, what did his lawyer have to say about all this? Because I feel like there is, even if you don't agree with Jordan Peterson, and I'm sure there are many listeners who don't, and perhaps listeners who do, there's a sense that, well, why should my professional body get to tell me what I can and can't tweet? Like, what's the legal argument here?
Yeah. Well, the issue that his lawyer raised is basically, if they can do this for Jordan Peterson in the College of Psychologists, what does this mean for other professions? So if you're an engineer or a lawyer or an MD or a nurse, or there's probably other professions that are not coming immediately to mind, to what extent can your personal opinions or political opinions online be policed by this professional association that you are a part of? So to some extent, that's the legal question, right? Is we all have rights to free expression. To what extent can those be, sort of circumscribed by professional associations? And it's sort of, well, as journalists, we're sort of in the same boat, right? I mean, as a reporter, my political opinions are not something that I get to share. Not a part of a professional association or anything, but are my free speech rights being affected in some fashion because I need to maintain objectivity and fairness in my reporting, right? So it's sort of it's a similar case for all sorts of other professions. You can imagine, well, we know that's the case for plenty of people. We saw during the pandemic, people who got into trouble and lost their jobs over their political opinions, whether that was via sort of a professional association or simply because their boss felt that they should no longer be affiliated with the business because of their views. So that's sort of the outstanding legal question, I think, is to what extent can people's speech are there consequences or limits on speech that can be imposed by a professional association or an employer or something like that? So, maybe this has already been dealt with. You imagine that there has to have been some jurisprudence about this at some point in the past, but it has become a larger issue than just him. For example, the Alberta Law Society had a discussion about whether or not they were going to eliminate sort of Indigenous history training for new lawyers. That effort ultimately failed, but that was an example of another sort of speech adjacent case. And then at the United Conservative Party, Alberta's government, at the party convention in, I think it was late October or early November, there was a policy resolution that was debated that asked whether or not the government should try and rein in the ways that professional associations can perhaps regulate the behavior, the non-work related behavior of some of their members. So it is a little bit of a larger issue than Jordan Peterson. And so his lawyer had talked about that in terms of, this isn't just a Jordan Peterson thing. This is where are the lines for these associations when it comes to free expression?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even this spills over into the political arena. I believe it was Pierre Poilievre tweeted that, this is the state of Justin Trudeau's Canada, and if he's in power, things will change. Is there a change? Could a federal government or a provincial government pass legislation that prevents professional organizations from intervening in these kind of cases?
Well, it's a good question. And I suspect the federal government would have a lot more trouble with it, just for division of power reasons. A lot of these professions are sort of self-regulating. The provincial governments give over the regulation of these professions so that they don't have to do it. Maybe the Alberta government could take over discipline and professional regulation of all these different professions, but they do sort of exist for a reason and are independent from government for a reason. So maybe there would be some way for a province to craft legislation around that. You have to wonder what sort of pushback they would get from professional associations, and whether or not they would feel that they were being subject to political power and political enforcement of the way that they operate these sorts of things. So, I don't know if it's been tested, is maybe the lazy part, the lazy way to answering the question. I'm almost certain the feds wouldn't have that power, because you have provincial associations for almost all of these things. There's not a national body of psychologists that does discipline, for example. It's all provincial. So the provincial government, I think, would likely have more power to do those sorts of things. But I don't know if anywhere has gone ahead with anything of that sort. Certainly not that I can think of it, and you have to imagine there'd be headlines all over the place if a provincial government had decided to do that.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is a fascinating discussion, whether you agree or disagree with Mr. Peterson. Tyler, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox, theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Tyler Dawson. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.